Great. The next speaker is Paul Maley. Paul has several presentations. The first is about an occultation of Regulus on May 24th of this year. And also he observed that in Saudi Arabia, and another occultation last month in India. And finally, Paul wants to present some stuff he just got in the last day about priorities for next year from the Southwest Research Institute. Paul? Go ahead.
Okay, this first presentation is on the rather successful and semi-unsuccessful occultation of the Regulus event that occurred only in Saudi Arabia. And if you can go to the next slide, please. This was a rather complicated organization. As some of you know, I tend to travel outside the United States trying to promote international cooperation amongst various amateur groups. I've had a few successes, and I've listed these since 1979, ranging from the first photo that was ever taken of an asteroid occultation from Georgetown, Guyana. Myself and Walter Nissen climbed to the top of the Guyana Pegasus Hotel because it was too dangerous to observe the occultation from the ground due to crime activity. And we got a break in the clouds, and it came right over us, and we were able to see that. And then most recently, the last one here from India, but with other things, Cuba, Iraq, Indonesia, South Africa, and some others. If you go to the next slide, please. I've also had a spectacular series of failures, which I don't like to talk about, but these are some of the places where I've attempted asteroid occultations, and they haven't worked out the way I planned. Usually it's been because of weather, or the prediction was way off. And so I'm just going to let that slide go. Okay, next slide, please. So going on to the event at hand, as you know, Regulus is magnitude 1.2 and is the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, and it has an Arabic identifier, Qalb al-Assad. Next slide, please. So this was the path, and you can see most of it is in daylight. It crossed over the Red Sea near the city of Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, and went across that garden spot called Yemen, and finally off into the Indian Ocean. So it gave us a very limited window of places that we could see. What you don't see on here is actually the tail end of the path, almost at 0 degrees elevation, was in Indonesia. And I had talked to Richard Nugent and Chuck Harold and David Dunham and his wife, and I talked my wife into going to Saudi Arabia initially. But because of the fact that the Saudis never did reply to very specific questions that were necessary to have answered prior to going over there, I was getting a little bit worried that perhaps this thing should be completely canceled. In fact, my initial inquiry was to a contact of David's in Saudi Arabia, and he never replied to me at all. But finally, I dug out my own contacts and was able to get a response or two about 4 months prior to the occultation. And then as the days got closer in, we had provided all the visa information and everything was in place, but they never would tell us where were we staying, what was the logistical plan, how many observers did we have, how much equipment should I bring, until like 2 weeks ahead of time. By that time, Chuck and Richard had both canceled out, and David had and his wife decided to go to Indonesia. So that left me and my wife going to Saudi Arabia with a lot of uncertainty. Next slide, please. So Richard Nugent prepared this little graphic showing the 4 o'clock figure between Regulus, the Moon, and Jupiter. It was a fairly high elevation occultation, and of course Regulus being naked eye, I was very concerned that some of the people there wouldn't necessarily know where Regulus was, but luckily one of my 2 contacts was able to gin up a training session with local students at the university, and they were able to point out where Regulus was. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of a close-up. You can see that Jeddah is there on the coast near the southern boundary, and Mecca is just off to the right. So we had to go up the highway number 5, in order to try to lay out some stations. Now, the plan was, when David and I were going to jointly bring a bunch of sites, we were going to interleave them, alternating my site, his site, my site, his site, So we could try to be sure to cover the entire area from one red line to the other red line. But when David pulled out, we agreed that he would take his sites, but in Indonesia, and I would retain the initial sites that I had here in Saudi Arabia. That was actually not a very good plan in the end, but of course, not knowing how accurate the path was, and I just took my chances figuring that one or two of these sites might end up getting a hit. Next slide, please. Okay, so the day of our arrival, 21 people were killed in an ISIL bombing for the first time in Saudi Arabia. So this was not an auspicious beginning, and of course we were all a little bit concerned that we originally wanted to go to the southeastern part where it was much darker because the occultation occurred in Jeddah very shortly after sunset. So there was not a lot of time to prepare all these sites. Normally I set up every site and then people come and they operate the equipment. But this time I had to get people to find the site themselves, find the star themselves, and operate the equipment. That turned out to be not a very good plan, but it was the only plan that I could do when you're seeing an occultation that occurs very shortly after sunset. Next slide, please. So, okay, this talks about the airport in Saudi Arabia. One of the really negative factors was the fact that if you look up airport reviews and you look up the Jeddah airport, it is like the worst airport in the world, mainly because millions of people come through there for the Hajj, the pilgrimage to go to Mecca, and so it's like a transit point, and it's a complete disaster. Every review I've ever seen of the airport was either really bad or close to being awful. Go ahead. So again, I was very concerned about the timing of coming in there, getting delayed, perhaps not finding our contacts. But our contacts decided that they would go ahead and promote the occultation based on the Regulus event that happened in the United States. I pointed them to the webpage and said, let's go out to Facebook, try to let people observe, naked eye. They don't have to make timings, just be aware of the event's going to happen to see what we can get. So this was the Arabic one of the advertisements that occurred on the internet that they produced. Next slide, please. In addition to the fact I talked about time the sat so people could use cell phones and try to do it this way. So here's another example of local publicity. That's the English part. This is the Arabic part where you actually see the path shown on the map, and they describe more of that in a further article. Go ahead to the next slide. So here we were, we finally come out of customs, and there's a guy with a sign welcoming us there, so we breathed a big sigh of relief because we didn't know if anybody was even going to show up. That's how risky this thing was. So in that little green rolling bag, I had 6 stations of all my equipment, and it fits on board. I didn't have to check it or anything, so it worked out very well. Next slide, please. So they put us up in a really nice hotel. I thought we'd be paying for it ourselves, but the university paid for everything, which is a huge surprise. Next slide. At this hotel, it's right in front of a really spectacular fountain that shoots water up like 150, 200 feet in the air. This is just one of the tourist shots. Go ahead, next slide. When you come through when you're going through the check-in line, they separate women from men, and the women have their own line, and they get searched by women officers, and the men have their own line. It's very discriminatory, and my wife, for good reason, was extremely hesitant about even flying there. Women are treated not very well in Saudi Arabia and have 0 rights. In fact, in order for my wife to go anywhere, I had to be with her, and that was something that nobody really likes to do here in the United States. People like their independence and their freedom, and you don't really have that over there. Go ahead, next slide. So here we are in front of the Intercontinental Hotel, and you can see my wife has got a hijab and actually an abaya on, because that's the law. If you don't wear this stuff, you're subject to really bad treatment over there. So she blended in and everything went well. Next slide. This is the university that house both our sponsors and the students who are manning the equipment. Next slide. This is, you can't really see this very well, but I'm standing in the Department of Astronomy office, and my camera is pointed across. And in the next room, there is a prayer area, and all the students and their mentors are praying while we're waiting there to talk to them. Go ahead, next slide. And these are our two hosts on either side of me, and I was asked to give a presentation. I had my briefcase with equipment in it. Next slide. And here's the Mighty Mini on the table, and I'm showing people how to use it, and each of the student teams were able to go through and understand how to activate the Canon camcorder and plug in the batteries to the camera and point it at Regulus. Next slide.
Did you need a translator, Paul? Or were they...
No, I did not, actually. All the students understood English, as did the two professors who were in charge of the astronomy department. So here's another example showing how everybody's kind of gathering around. It started out as a very formal presentation, but everybody kind of loosened up when they realized, you know, this is fun stuff and doesn't have to be a high-powered type of operation. Go ahead. Again, here I'm showing them the Canon ZR camcorder and how it can easily fail, and trying to help them along to be sure it doesn't. Next slide. So here we are driving through traffic. It's sort of a clear day. The biggest concern I had is I'd been to that area in May in the past, and there's a constant jet stream of clouds going over. The last time I was there was in Abu Dhabi and got clouded over for an event. And so I was rather worried, but the sky was reasonably clear. Next slide. And everywhere you see pictures of the local rulers in Saudi Arabia and really expensive looking buildings, brand new. Go ahead. Not sure why I took that picture, but it's one of the apartment buildings where some of the people live. You don't see a lot of poverty there. Next slide. Go ahead. And every once in a while you will see a couple of people sleeping on a bench, and you think, well, they're unemployed or they're drunk, and they're not. They just like to hang out in places like this. So they're just normal people. Go ahead. Next slide. And people actually sit out here and they fish, and I was out here running one morning and was able to get a couple of pictures of some of the locals. In the background you can see the sky is not completely clear, but it is sort of hazy. One of the problems is a lot of the dust that comes up from the desert is lifted up into the air, and it diminishes the sky brightness, and that's a real problem. Next slide. For this occultation, Regulus was a very high elevation, and I was quite concerned that if the sky was clear, we would have a difficult time seeing it. So on the day of the event, it had been clear all the way up to the day of the event, and in the morning it was completely overcast. So this is right at sunrise, and I was really apprehensive about what was going to happen later. Go ahead. So here we are. It's late in the afternoon, and we're driving out toward the site, and the sky is mostly cleared up. We're looking at the desert, and you probably can't see because it's not dark enough in here, but you see plastic bags and trash and stuff that's being blown by the desert winds along the side of the road as we're headed out. Next slide. So here we are at the first site. We're setting it up. I put one of the Mighty Minis, and everybody's looking around and trying to figure out what to do and making sure they understand the process. Next slide. Here's an idea of what the imagery looks like for the weather. Somebody had an iPhone there, and you can see the Red Sea is completely clear, and the edge of it, where Jeddah is also completely in the clear, but off to the northeast is where all the clouds are building. Next slide. And so you can see just before sunset, about an hour and a half before the occultation, the sun is barely visible. It's like 5 degrees up, and you can see this haze. Next slide. So here's a team, and what you might not be aware of is this black smoke is from a fire that developed in the afternoon, and we were concerned that even if the sky was clear, the sky would be obscured because of this. Go ahead. And there it is. That's a more severe example. And as we were driving, we were literally driving parallel and into this stuff. But luckily, it did dissipate just before the occultation. Next slide. So here we are at my site. Everybody's gone off to their own location. I had a student here with me, and we set up on the side of the road, and I'm starting to put my equipment together. Next slide. And my wife is taking pictures, and of course she has to still wear the local garb, even though we're kind of in a private area. Next slide. And so my student observer has laid out his prayer carpet and is getting ready to pray just before the occultation. Next slide. Again, this is something you don't see in Kansas, Bob. So here we are. The student took a picture of myself and my wife looking up at the moon. I didn't know that was taking place until they emailed it to me. And you can see the sky is fairly clear, but in fact, the first magnitude star looked more like a third magnitude star due to the haze, and Regulus is almost straight up. So had it been much lower in the sky, we probably wouldn't have been able to see it. Next slide. All right, so here I am trying to point the scope, and this is an extra prayer carpet that the student brought out for me to use for occultation work. So I had my towel from the Intercontinental Hotel and a prayer carpet for pointing. Go ahead. Next slide. This is we have 6 sites. This is the layout. You can see from one end to the other, 58 kilometers north to 58 kilometers south, we had a roughly equally distant set of separations from each of the sites, and these are the people that were making the observations. Now, I didn't make these assignments, and this is an important thing for me to tell you now. In fact, I was going to choose the site here near the edge, but it turns out that the head of the astronomy department decided he was going to make the assignments and said, fine, go ahead. So he put me at site number 3, which happened to be very crucial. Next slide. So this was what I got at my site. I believe this is a graphic produced either by Brad or Tony. I can't remember which one of them. And you can see I got a really nice occultation. No question about that. I was extremely happy. Next slide. And so I didn't know whether anybody had gotten any observations at all. So I sent this to Brad and Tony, and this was produced, this single cohort event. Next slide. So then I've got the rest of the data looked at, and I took all the camcorders and was able to examine them and found out that at least 2 of these sites had misses. Go ahead, next slide. Okay, and then the concern was, where was my observation relative to the other people? So there were 6 sites, and there was actually a 7th site, and so we made an assumption that perhaps my observation was south of the center, and this was the graphic that was produced. Next slide. And then I believe Brad produced another one saying, okay, what if I was actually north, and this is what it looked like. Next slide. So luckily this new observation from people at the university that weren't even announced as observing, we were able to pin down exactly where my chord was. And it was really unfortunate that none of the other observers actually got any data. And I was the only one, which made me really unhappy because that was not my intent. But it turned out a couple of people pointed at the wrong star. How can you miss Regulus? I mean, it's Regulus, the moon, Jupiter. Very, very simple. But it does happen, and it did happen. It was unfortunate. And the people that were on the star really got a miss. Next slide. And it turned out that the student next to me had a 35 millimeter camera. He pointed it up at Regulus and got this occultation with the video system on his camera. I had no idea he was going to do that. And this was the reduction that was produced by, I believe, Brad. Next slide. So we actually had 2 events at my site, but it was the same one. So this is the end. Okay, next presentation is on the India occultation, and there's 2 of them with almost the same name, so you might want to, yeah, go to the, yeah.
Were you having just point to Regulus?
Okay, the question was I having all the students point directly to Regulus? And the answer is yes. Using Richard Nugent's graphic, they were able to hopefully find the right star. But without a finder, they were just kind of, Mighty Mini is just like this, you kind of move it around, it's got a 3-degree field, and theoretically when you look through the output of a camcorder, a star that looks like third magnitude could easily be confused with Regulus. And that's what happened in at least 2 cases. And normally I would have set up each of the telescopes, but I wasn't able to do it because of the time from sunset. Okay, so here we have the first, what I would say, astrotourism expedition that I've organized specifically for an asteroid occultation. If I had organized this and said, we're going to go observe an asteroid occultation in India, nobody would have signed up. But instead, the trip was concocted around Bhutan, Sikkim, which are 2 countries that hardly anybody visits, and India, and then and also Nepal. But then the earthquake happened in Nepal, kind of like when Tony was interested in going with me to the Republic of Mali for an occultation a couple of years ago. Then there was a big war, and so I had to cancel the whole thing, so that expedition kind of went down the tubes. Well, in Nepal, they had the big earthquake, and that was almost a catastrophe because the path that was initially on Derek's site for the occultation went right through Bhutan, right through the area we were going to go in. And I figured this is just fantastic. But as the months passed and a new path was issued, it moved. And the path moved actually west of Bhutan down into India. And for some weird reason, it went right over New Delhi, which is our entry and exit point. So I was able to pull something out of this after all. Let's go to the next slide here. So here's the path. You can't really tell, but India is really on the far end. And in fact, the elevation from Bhutan, had it still been there, would have been 17 degrees. From India, it was only 12. And that was a really bad situation. Next slide. Reason being, India is very, very polluted. And if you've ever been there, you'll know that it's as bad as China. So here's the path as it's shown. It's centrally, actually the path was somewhat north, and then on Steve's final prediction, the path moved a little bit to the south of New Delhi, and coincidentally, I had pre-planned a site near a place called Damdama Lake, and the center of it now was geared to go 2 kilometers from my pre-planned site, so I was really jumping up and down for that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is Delhi on a typical day. It could be Beijing too, but it's really polluted, and this is not an exaggeration. Next slide. And so, as an example of a typical slide from India, not only do you see people walking down the street, but you see packs of dogs hanging around, and actually my wife and I run, and so we ran down the street, but the dogs, it's so hot out there, the dogs weren't really interested in chasing us. But you can also see in the background, the sky is clear. In fact, they're in a clear period during the month of October, and so I was really excited about that. And so all we had to worry about is whether the haze would be present. Next slide. Okay, so this is Damdama Lake. You can't see on here, but this is a close-up using Google Maps. And everywhere you see in India, there are people. There are houses, there are huts, there are people every place. Well, this is the only place in the area where you do a close-up, you don't see anybody. And I figured, oh, this is great. So I emailed A.J. Talwar, who's an Indian observer, and he said, sure, I'll go down here and check out this site. And so eventually, after 3 or 4 months, he checked the site out. He said, oh, yeah, it's a great site. Don't worry about it. Not a problem. So I said, cool. So I stuck on this site. This is where we were going to go. Next slide. Okay, so I took this photo on the night of the occultation. And you probably can't tell. There's a lake there, and this is pointing in the direction of the star. You can't see anything there. It's kind of hazed out. In fact, it was a clear night, but the haze was so bad you couldn't really see anything from about 15 degrees on down. Next slide. This is like 2 hours before the occultation. So here's our team. My contact is the upper right in the white shirt, Suhas Gurjar, who actually had driven 1,000 miles to come to this place so we could have this joint expedition. two people from Australia to his left, Byron Braswell and Dr. Chris, that's their last name, and my wife and myself. And then there you can see off to the right is my little tripod with a 80 millimeter MIDI on it. So we arrive there, and immediately we notice that there are people walking, driving with cars, with motorbikes, and we're on the edge of the lake, not on a road even, and they're just driving by, and they're walking by. And it is a really bad situation. What appeared to be something private is not private. Well, it turns out it was a Saturday night in Delhi, and people who live in the area, they like to go to the lake. Well, nobody ever told me that, or we might have tried to go someplace else. So this was turning into a really terrible situation. I planned to set up two sites roughly 5 miles apart. That plan just went out the window. And then we decided to set up two sites about 50 feet apart. That turned out to be really bad as well. Next slide. Because people were just coming, and it was dark, and you couldn't tell what they were going to do. Other problems. We had wild pigs that were running past. In fact, two of them came within about 8 feet of the telescope, so I had to get the observers in an arc to serve as a buffer to block the pigs. In addition, we had cows that were wandering down the same little path that came by our site. So we decided to park the vans to try to block the road, but people would come and just drive around them and walk around them. It was chaos, total chaos. Next slide. So here I am trying to struggle, and I've got this telescope. I'm trying to point it across the lake. I'm trying to see stars, and there's no stars to see. So I ended up having to move up at a higher elevation, work my way down by star hopping. Eventually I got to the area where I could see a pre-point star. It took me more than an hour to do that. Next slide. So just before the occultation, and I mean like 2 minutes before the occultation, telescopes pointed, I'm recording, people start fires on the edge of the lake directly in front of them. You see the little flames? It's much worse than what you see here. And all of a sudden I'm looking at my monitor and I'm getting this big flare. What the hell is this? And so the people built these fires right there, literally in line with azimuth 78, elevation 12 degrees, but they were like at 0 degrees. Next slide. Okay, so in the end, I actually got an event. Sent it in to Brad and Tony, and they were able to produce it. About 17 kilometers to the north, the other team that had driven up from Jaipur with Suhas was the team leader, and they had like a 10-inch reflector, and they had their own method of recording video. I believe it was using a drift scan method. They got a good event, I got a good event, and we had two chords coming across, and then this past week I heard from Brad that a Chinese observer for the first time had reported a miss. It turns out that his location was literally at the edge of the path, on the southern edge, that blue cord down there. So he was able to provide an unexpected limit on the southern boundary. So this is the composite fitted to an ellipse. Next slide. And so on the way back, I had planned an aurora expedition from the airplane. In fact, I was able to take this photo out the window. I know it looks terrible here, but I took a series of pictures of the aurora on the way from Delhi back to Newark, and I spent about 30 minutes. So we had a really good display out there. So you never know what you're going to see, so it made this expedition even better. So the question is, what is next in India? And there's another presentation there that's got India on it as well. So the people that I made contact with are interested in doing occultations, and in fact they've done 2 asteroid occultations in the past 2 years and have not reported them because they didn't know who to report to. This is an ongoing problem as to if you live in Saudi Arabia or if you live in India, who do you report occultations to, and that has to be resolved. Do you have that third one there?
I do not have another India presentation.
It's logistics of trying to procure equipment and hopefully do another joint occultation with them next year. There's a really good event coming over Pune, which is the location of where they live in western India. That looks like a pretty outstanding event in late next year. So, next slide.